Mountain Man accidentally marries a fat Amish woman. He refused to ever let her go. By God above, he's marrying the fat Amish girl. The jeering voice cut through the hush inside Harmony Creek's small wooden church. Guests twisted in their pews, gasping, laughing, whispering. At the altar stood Ezekiel Bear Thornfield, towering and broad-shouldered, a mountain man who rarely descended from Pine Ridge. Beside him, shaking, cheeks flushed with humiliation, stood Patience Patty Yoder, a 24-year-old Amish woman with kind eyes and a body her community never let her forget was too much. It had all happened in a blur. Bear had walked into the chapel to witness his friend Jacob's wedding. Patty had entered searching for her sister, the true bride, but Reverend McKinnon, confused and fumbling, had declared them bride and groom. Before either could protest, vows were spoken, words stumbled out, and the final blessing rang across the rafters. Now the congregation roared with disbelief. "She doesn't belong to him," Patty's father bellowed from the pews. "My daughter cannot be shackled to a wildman from the mountains." "Bear's been trapped," another voice laughed. "He'll run back to his cabin before the night falls." Patty's throat burned. Her heart pounded with shame as every eye stabbed into her softness, her plain dress, her trembling hands. She wanted to melt into the floorboards, to vanish before the laughter could crush her completely. But then Bear shifted. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his massive hand over hers. The church hushed. His voice, low and steady, rolled through the silence like distant thunder. "I may not have come here for a bride," he said, blue eyes locked on Patty's, "but before God and man I will keep my vow. She is my wife, and I will never let her go." The room erupted again, but this time neither Patty nor Bear flinched. The town of Harmony Creek was small, but gossip traveled fast. By the time Bear and Patty stepped out of the church, the story had already begun its poisonous crawl through both communities. The mountain man who married the fat Amish girl by mistake. For Patty, humiliation pressed down like a physical weight. She kept her eyes lowered, hands clutched tightly in front of her apron. All her life she had been the girl people whispered about, too plump for the young Amish men, too quiet to defend herself. And now she had become a spectacle, a joke carried on every lip. Her father, Elder Samuel Yoder, stormed forward, his weathered face twisted with fury. "This is an abomination," he spat. "My daughter has been tricked by an outsider, a man who lives like a beast in the wilderness. This marriage is not binding." But Reverend McKinnon, still flustered, shook his head. The vows were spoken before God. What has been joined cannot be undone. Bear loomed beside Patty, silent at first, letting the old man rage. He was used to ridicule. He had known it since his wife and child were lost in a snowstorm years ago, since he chose exile on Pine Ridge rather than face the pity of neighbors. But when Elder Yoder jabbed a finger toward Patty, calling her shamed and ruined, Bear finally spoke. "She is not ruined," his voice rumbled, quiet but dangerous. "She is my wife." The crowd gasped, even Patty's breath caught. She dared to glance up at him then, and what she saw in his eyes was not mockery nor reluctance, but a calm certainty that unsettled her more than the laughter had. Her sister Mary rushed to her side, whispering urgently, "Patty, this isn't your fault. We'll fix this, But Bear's massive hand rested gently on Patty's shoulder, anchoring her. "There will be no fixing," he said firmly. "What's done is done. I spoke my vow, and I'll keep it." The townsfolk muttered, some in amusement, some in disbelief. "He's gone mad," one man sneered. "Imagine binding himself to her." Bear ignored them. He bent to pick up Patty's small carpet bag, slinging it over his broad shoulder as though it weighed nothing. "Come," he told her simply. Patty's feet refused to move. I can't," she whispered. "I don't even know you." His blue gaze held hers, steady as the mountains. "You'll know me in time. For now, trust this." He touched his chest with a calloused hand. "I will not break what God has bound." Behind them, Elder Yoder shouted threats of annulments and punishments, but the crowd was already shifting, eager to spread the tale. Within the hour, both Amish and English townsfolk would be retelling the scene, each version crueler than the last. Patty felt her cheeks flame, her body heavy with shame. Yet when Bear led her toward his wagon, shielding her from the stairs with his sheer size, a strange flicker stirred in her heart. He did not laugh at her. He did not recoil. Instead, he carried her bag, claimed her as wife, and walked with the unyielding stride of a man who would not be moved. For the first time in her life, Patty wondered, perhaps her worth was not measured by her size, her plainness, or her father's scorn. Perhaps, just perhaps, this accidental husband saw something more. The wheels of Bear Thornfield's wagon creaked as it rolled out of Harmony Creek, leaving the whispers and stares of the town behind. Patty sat rigid on the wooden bench beside him, her bonnet pulled low to hide her burning cheeks. The road stretched upward, winding toward Pine Ridge, where Bear had built his life in isolation. Neither spoke at first. The clop of hooves, the rattle of wheels, and the cry of crows overhead filled the silence. Patty clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her heart twisting. Every bump in the road reminded her of what she had left behind, her family, her community, the only life she had ever known. At last, her voice trembled out. "You didn't have to do this. We could have explained. Reverend McKinnon, he made a mistake." Bear's hands tightened on the reins. "A mistake to him. But vows are vows, Miss Yoder. I won't break mine." "Patty," she whispered, "if I must be your wife, call me Patty." He glanced at her then, the corner of his mouth twitching beneath his beard. "Patty, then?" The wagon jolted as the trail grew rougher. Pines closed in on both sides, their scent sharp in the cool autumn air. Shadows stretched long across the ground. Patty shivered. Her simple Amish shawl was no match for the mountain wind. Without a word, Bear reached behind the seat, pulled out a heavy wool coat, and draped it over her shoulders. She blinked at him. Thank you. You'll need it. Nights up here cut sharper than any knife." As they climbed higher, the landscape grew wilder. Streams glittered as they spilled down the slopes, and deer darted across the path. The sheer scale of the wilderness made Patty's breath catch. It was beautiful, yes, but also terrifying. How could a woman raised in a quiet Amish village survive in such a place? Bear must have sensed her unease. He pointed to the ridgeline. "See that peak? That's Hawk's Crown. My cabin sits just below. Strong walls, plenty of wood stacked. It'll hold against any storm." Patty swallowed. "You built it yourself?" "Aye, with these two hands." He lifted one massive palm scarred from axe and hammer. "Built it for a family I never got to keep." Pain flickered in his eyes, and Patty knew enough to remain silent. Still, her chest tightened at the thought. This man had known loss deep enough to carve hollows into him. Night fell before they reached the summit. Bear guided the wagon into a small clearing beside a stream and began to make camp. Patty tried to help, gathering sticks for the fire, but her fingers fumbled in the dark. At last, she returned with only a few twigs. He looked at her collection and said simply, "It's enough." When the flames caught, the clearing glowed warm against the night. Bear handed her a tin plate with bread and venison jerky. She hesitated, ashamed of how hungrily she wanted it. Men in her community had often mocked her appetite. Bear noticed her pause. "Eat, Patty. Food's meant to be eaten." She took a bite. The smoky meat filled her mouth. The warmth of the fire wrapped her shoulders, and for the first time since the chaotic wedding, she felt her body unclench. Later, Bear spread out 2 bedrolls, one near the fire, the other farther away beneath a pine. Patty frowned. "Why so far?" He looked at her steadily. "Because respect matters. I won't take what isn't freely given." Her throat closed with a mix of relief and something sharper, something she dared not name. She lay awake long after, listening to the crackle of the fire and the quiet scrape of his whetstone as he sharpened a blade. He was keeping watch, she realized, guarding her as she slept. For all the world's laughter, for her father's fury, here in the dark wilderness, she felt the faintest glimmer of safety, perhaps even belonging. By the time the wagon finally rolled into Bear Thornfield's clearing, the morning sun was streaming over the ridge. Patty pulled the heavy coat tighter around her as she gazed at the cabin that would now be her home. It was not large, but it was strong. Logs fitted tight together, a stone chimney rising tall, smoke already drifting from its mouth. A barn leaned against the edge of the woods, and beyond it a small pen held chickens pecking at the earth. To Patty's eyes, raised in an Amish settlement where neat white houses stood in rows, it looked rough and untamed. Yet there was order here, too. Stacks of firewood, tools hung carefully, a bucket filled at the well. Bear lifted her carpetbag and carried it inside without effort. Patty followed, her heart pounding. The cabin smelled of pine, leather, and smoke. A great hearth dominated the main room, fire crackling bright. A sturdy oak table sat by the window, a shelf of hand-carved bowls and cups above it. Against one wall was a broad bed covered in thick quilts, but what drew her breath short was the smaller room just beyond, a space he had prepared with surprising care. The floor was swept, a small bed neatly made, and by the window a rocking chair faced the woods. "This one's yours," Bear said, setting down her bag, until we find what we are to each other." Patty touched the quilt folded on the bed. Amish stitching, she realized. "Where did you get this?" "Your people trade in town," he said. "I've bought their work for years. Strong hands make strong cloth." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then Bear cleared his throat. "Rest now. I'll tend the animals." So began their new life together. Patty woke early each morning, her old habits guiding her. She swept the cabin, tended the hearth, and tried to make the place more homelike. Her clumsy hands fumbled at first with his heavy pots and rough-hewn utensils, but Bear never mocked her. If a stew was too thin or bread too hard, he only said, "We'll eat it just the same." When she burned her fingers on the kettle one evening, he reached for her hand with surprising gentleness. His rough thumb brushed the reddened skin. "You work too hard," he murmured. She drew back quickly, cheeks burning hotter than the flame. An Amish woman is meant to work. Idleness is sin. He grunted, but said no more. Bear's days were filled with labor, splitting logs, mending fences, hunting in the hills. Yet he always returned with something for her. Berries gathered in his broad palms, fresh caught trout from the stream, or simply more wood for the fire so she would not grow cold. He never boasted of these small acts. He simply laid them before her and carried on. Patty, in turn, began to stitch bits of comfort into the cabin. Curtains from spare cloth, a rug woven from old rags, simple meals flavored with herbs she knew from her mother's garden. Slowly, the rough log walls began to feel less like a stranger's shelter and more like a home. One evening, after she had mended a tear in his shirt, Bear studied her needlework by firelight. "Your hands are steady," he said. "Mine break things more than they mend." Patty smiled faintly. "Then it is good we were paired, for I mend what you break, and you protect what I cannot." He met her eyes then, and something unspoken passed between them. Respect, perhaps even admiration. When winter came early, the snow fell heavy on Pine Ridge. The wind howled at the shutters, but inside the cabin, warmth grew. They shared meals by the fire, spoke in quiet voices as the storm raged outside. Bear began to teach her the ways of the mountain, how to split kindling, how to read animal tracks, how to listen to the silence of the forest. Patty taught him patience, prayer before supper, gentle words when anger stirred. She reminded him that strength was not only in muscle, but in restraint, in kindness. And though they still slept in separate rooms, a tenderness grew between them that neither dared name aloud. One night, after he carried her a steaming mug of broth when she was weary, she whispered, "You treat me as if I matter." Bear paused, his gaze steady on hers. "Because you do." Patty turned her face away, tears pricking her eyes. All her life she had been too much, too large, too plain, too quiet. Yet here, in a cabin on a mountain, she was enough. By the time the snow melted on Pine Ridge, word of the accidental marriage had spread far beyond Harmony Creek. What began as whispers in town had turned into biting gossip that reached even the Amish settlement. And though Patty worked hard to make the cabin a home, she could not ignore the shadow pressing at their door. One evening, as she shelled beans by the fire, Bear returned from town with a dark look in his eyes. He set his rifle against the wall and dropped a folded paper onto the table. "What is it?" Patty asked softly. "Your father." His voice was rough. "He's petitioned the sheriff. Claims this marriage was fraud. Demands it be annulled." Her hand stilled. She had expected disapproval, anger, even banishment. But to drag the law into it, her heart sank. "Sheriff Reeves says Fairmont's backing him," Bear added. "Seems the man don't like being made a fool at the church. Claims I stole his bride." Patty's cheeks burned. "I was never his bride. I was only there for Mary." Bear's gaze softened, but the steel in his jaw remained. "Doesn't matter. Men like Fairmont think truth bends to money. And your father," he exhaled, "he'll never believe I didn't trick you." That night, Patty lay awake, torn between two worlds. In her heart, she had begun to find peace beside Bear. His quiet strength, his steady hands, the way he never once mocked her body or appetite. But the echo of her father's voice haunted her. "You do not belong here. You are Amish. You are mine to decide for." The days that followed brought more strain. When Bear went into town for supplies, men jeered at him. "How's life with your fat bride?" they taunted. "Bet she keeps you warm in winter." Others sneered that he had tricked an innocent Amish girl for company. Bear ignored them, but the tension clung to his shoulders when he returned. Patty, too, faced whispers when she dared visit her sister. "You've abandoned us," Bishop Stoltzfus scolded. "You've yoked yourself to a wildman. You shame your family." Yet Mary, her sister, grasped her hands in secret and whispered, "You look happier than I've ever seen you." But Bear carried his own ghosts. One stormy night, after a long silence by the fire, he spoke in a voice hollow with grief. "I once had a wife, a boy. Lost them both to the blizzard of '97. Cabin collapsed while I was away hunting. By the time I returned—" His eyes burned and he clenched his fist. "I swore I'd never love again, never risk failing another soul." Patty reached across the table, laying her hand over his. "You didn't fail him. The storm did." He looked at her then, raw pain meeting raw compassion. And though he said nothing more, Patty knew she had glimpsed the wound that kept him locked away from the world. Spring brought confrontation. Sheriff Reeves rode up to the cabin with 2 deputies, Fairmont smirking at his side. Elder Yoder came too, his face hard as stone. "This is no fit union," the sheriff declared. "Your marriage is contested. Elder Yoder claims you were coerced. Fairmont claims injury to his reputation. If you value your peace, Ironwood, hand her back." Patty's breath caught. Hand her back, like she was property, livestock to be bartered. Bear stepped forward, towering over them, his voice low but shaking with restrained fury. "She is my wife, by vow before God, and if you think to take her, you'll have to walk through me." Fairmont sneered. "You'd fight the law for her? For an accident?" Bear's gaze was steady as the mountain. "I'd fight the world." Patty, trembling, found her voice. She stepped out from behind him, her bonnet falling back. "I am not an accident. I chose to remain when I could have run. I will not be handed back like a sack of grain." The clearing fell silent. Even the sheriff faltered, uncertainty flashing in his eyes. But one thing was clear. The battle for their marriage had only begun. The knock came hard enough to rattle the cabin walls. Patty froze at the hearth, her half-sewn quilt slipping from her lap. Outside, the crunch of boots on frozen earth and the scrape of rifles being readied sent a shiver down her spine. Bear rose slowly from his chair. He lifted his rifle from above the mantel, checked the chamber with a calmness that seemed carved in stone, and then glanced at her. "Stay behind me." But Patty shook her head, voice trembling yet firm. "No, I will not cower while they decide my fate. I am your wife. I'll stand with you." His eyes softened for a flicker of a second, but then the banging resumed. Sheriff Reeves' voice barked through the door. "Ironwood, by order of the law, surrender the woman. Elder Yoder demands her return to her people, and Fairmont demands restitution for the insult. Refuse, and we'll take her by force." Bear threw the door open wide. He filled the threshold like a fortress, rifle resting easily in his grip, his blue eyes flashing in the torchlight. "You'll take nothing, not from me, not from her." Fairmont stepped forward, his sneer twisted with rage. "She's Amish. She doesn't belong with a brute like you. She belongs to her father or to me." Patty moved before Bear could stop her. She stepped into the doorway beside him, her shawl whipping in the cold wind. Her voice carried clear and strong. "I am not property to be returned or claimed. I am Ezekiel Thornfield's wife. I chose to remain at his side when I could have walked away, and if you drag me from this mountain, you drag me lifeless." The deputies shifted uneasily. Even the sheriff's expression faltered. Fairmont barked a laugh, though it cracked at the edges. "Big words from a fat farm girl. What kind of life can she give you, Ironwood?" Bear's voice thundered, steady and unyielding. "The only kind that matters. She gives me truth. She gives me faith. She gives me a reason to breathe." He raised his rifle higher, barrel gleaming in the firelight. "Step 1 foot closer, Fairmont, and the mountain will remember your bones." For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. The fire in the hearth behind them crackled. The pines hissed in the wind, and the tension stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Finally, Sheriff Reeves lifted a hand, signaling his men back. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were wary. "This isn't worth blood tonight. Come on, Fairmont." Fairmont sputtered, cursing, but when Reeves turned his horse, the others followed. Soon their hoofbeats faded into the darkness. Patty sagged, tears blurring her sight. Bear set his rifle aside and caught her in his arms, holding her close against his chest. His voice, rough with emotion, whispered against her hair, "You're safe now. You'll always be safe here." And for the first time, Patty believed it. The cabin was quiet again. Outside, the night stretched wide and endless, but inside, the hearth glowed steady, filling the room with golden warmth. Patty sat at the table, her hand still trembling from the confrontation, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. Bear moved about the room in silence, banking the fire, setting his rifle back on its hooks. When he finally turned to her, the hardness in his face eased, and he crossed the room in 3 strides. He knelt before her, taking her work-roughened hands gently in his. "I've lived years thinking the mountain was all I'd ever have," he said, voice low. "Silence, solitude, memories I couldn't bury. But tonight, when you stood at that door beside me," he shook his head, his throat thick, "you gave me back more than I thought I could carry. You gave me hope." Patty's eyes brimmed. "All my life I was told I was too much or not enough. Too heavy, too plain, too quiet. But when you look at me, Bear, I feel seen, not mocked, not shamed, just me." His thumb brushed her knuckles, calloused but tender. "You are my wife, Patty Yoder Thornfield. And this," he gestured to the fire, the walls, the quilt she'd been stitching, "this is your home, if you'll have it." Tears slipped free, but her smile broke through them. "I already do." Bear rose then, pulling her into his arms. The storm had passed, the danger had retreated, but what lingered was stronger than fear, the promise of a life built not on accident, but on choice. And in the glow of the fire, Patty knew she had found not only a husband, but a home. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with choice, but with accident. A vow spoken too soon, a mistake no one planned. Yet out of it, a home was built, and 2 lives were forever changed. Maggie and Bear's tale reminds us that love does not ask for perfection. It asks for courage, patience, and faith. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from tonight? Do you still believe that love can arrive when we least expect it? If you do, stay with us. The next story waiting ahead is meant for you.